Rain slid down the hospital windows that April night in 1982, blurring the yellow glow of the Richmond Memorial parking lot. Nurses whispered about the young woman who had just given birth, a quiet brunette named Carolyn Hayes, 24, with eyes that carried both exhaustion and joy. At 11:17 p.m., she signed her discharge papers, wrapped her newborn in a white blanket, and stepped out into the storm. She was supposed to meet her husband by the entrance. He never saw her again. For days, her name filled the local papers. Young mother missing after leaving hospital. Police searched the James River banks, motels, and roadside ditches. Nothing. The story faded, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher headlines. 42 years later, the clipping still trembled in Emily Hayes' hand. The paper had yellowed, its edges curled like the corners of an old photograph, but the headline still screamed in bold, "New mother disappears leaving Richmond Hospital." Emily had found it tucked inside a Bible that once belonged to her grandmother. "If you love real-life mysteries that finally find justice," the narrator would say, "don't forget to subscribe to the channel." Emily's voice cracked as she read aloud. She was last seen wearing a blue raincoat, carrying her newborn daughter. That daughter was her. She traced the words as if they could somehow give her back the mother she never met. Outside her window, the same Virginia rain fell softly, a ghostly echo of that long-lost night. Her apartment smelled faintly of old paper and lavender. On the coffee table lay a stack of unanswered questions, her birth certificate, hospital forms, and a faded photo of a smiling woman holding an infant wrapped in white. Emily's grandmother had always said, "Some things are better left in the past." But Emily knew silence was a wall that only truth could break. She folded the clipping and whispered, "Not anymore." Growing up, she'd walked past Richmond Memorial countless times, never knowing the story of how her life began and how another ended. Now every brick of that hospital felt like a secret keeper. She imagined her mother's last steps, the weight of the child in her arms, the feeling of rain on her skin. Emily couldn't remember her, but she could feel her absence, like a word missing from every sentence of her life. She closed her eyes and heard her grandmother's warning echo, "Don't dig into ghosts, Emily." But it wasn't ghosts she was after. It was justice. Somewhere in the stacks of old police records, there had to be something. One forgotten detail, one overlooked clue, the kind that hides quietly for decades, waiting for someone brave enough to look again. She picked up her phone, heart pounding. The Virginia State Police website glowed in the dark. Cold Case Division, request for records. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then with a single breath, she typed her mother's name, Carolyn Hayes. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the glass as if urging her forward. That night, Emily made a promise, to find out what really happened on April 17, 1982, when a young mother vanished into the Virginia rain. For as long as Emily could remember, silence had been the language of her family. It wrapped around her childhood like fog, soft but suffocating. Her grandmother, Margaret Hayes, ran the house with Southern order, polished silver, pressed curtains, and no mention of Carolyn. The portrait of Emily's mother hung in the hallway, turned slightly away from the light, its frame collecting dust. When Emily was little, she would stand before it and whisper, "What happened to you?" But the walls never answered. Richmond in the late 80s carried the echoes of older traditions. Sunday mornings meant church bells, neighborhood gossip, and biscuits baking in cast-iron pans. Outwardly, the Hayes home fit right in, stable, respectable. But beneath that calm, a grief too heavy to name kept everyone at arm's length. Emily learned early that curiosity was a dangerous thing. One afternoon when she was 12, she asked her grandmother, "Do you think Mama's still alive?" Margaret froze mid-stir at the kitchen counter. The spoon trembled in her hand before she muttered, "Some questions don't deserve answers, child." Her voice was sharp, but her eyes glistened. Emily never asked again. Years passed, and the silence hardened into habit. High school, college, her first job, life moved on, but something in her always stayed behind. At 21, she left Richmond for a few years, trying to outrun the shadow of a woman she'd never met. Yet no matter where she went, The story followed. People would ask about her mother, and she'd smile politely, changing the subject. "She passed when I was a baby," she'd say, a lie that burned every time it left her lips. By her 30s, Emily had become quiet, observant, someone who listened more than she spoke. She worked as a librarian at the downtown branch, drawn to the comfort of old paper and forgotten stories. She liked to think every mystery had its answer, buried somewhere in a dusty archive, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. But her own story remained unsolved. Every year around April, she felt a pull she couldn't explain. The rain would come, soft and persistent, and she'd find herself driving by Richmond Memorial, staring at the building that had last seen her mother alive. The neon sign still glowed red against the dark sky, unchanged by decades. One evening, while closing the library, her co-worker Laura asked, "You ever think about finding out what really happened? There's DNA stuff now, podcasts, all that true crime interest. Someone might help." Emily gave a faint smile. "I don't know where to start," she said, but her mind didn't let it go. That night she dreamed of rain, footsteps, and a woman's voice calling her name. When she woke, her pillow was damp with tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. The silence had followed her long enough. Standing by the window, she looked out over the sleeping city. Richmond's lights blinked faintly through the mist. "Maybe it's time," she whispered. The words lingered in the quiet room, the first crack in a wall that had stood for 40 years. The phone call was almost too simple. Emily had spent days drafting emails, finding contact numbers for the Virginia State Police, and researching the cold case division, but in the end, all it took was a single call. "Cold case division. How can I help you?" The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "I'm looking for information on a missing person case from 1982, Emily said, her voice steady but her heart pounding. "Carolyn Hayes. She disappeared from Richmond Memorial Hospital." There was a pause. The woman on the line was probably scrolling through old records. The silence felt endless. "Let me check for you, ma'am," she said finally, her tone warm but distant. Emily held her breath, staring out of the window at the faint glow of streetlights in the fog. It was late, too late for most people to be awake. Yet she was wide awake, thinking of her mother's disappearance, thinking of the life she had never lived. The woman returned to the line after what felt like an eternity. "Ma'am, the records from 1982 are not exactly complete. There was some missing paperwork, some inconsistencies." Emily clenched the phone tighter. "Inconsistencies?" she repeated. "Yes, I'm afraid so. However, we can look into it. Would you like to request the case file officially?" Emily's stomach twisted. It wasn't what she wanted to hear, but it wasn't a dead end either. She was one step closer. "Please, I'd like to request it. Whatever you can give me." The call ended with a promise. Someone would be in touch within a few weeks. It wasn't much, but it was something. In the days that followed, Emily's mind raced with possibilities. What if the file held the answers? What if there was more? The thought of opening that file, of finally knowing what happened, was almost too overwhelming to grasp. She could feel it in her bones, the weight of history, the heaviness of a woman's life that had been swallowed by time. As she walked through the streets of Richmond, past the familiar shops, the sounds of traffic, and the honking cars, everything felt ordinary. Yet nothing had ever felt so extraordinary. Each person she passed could be a witness, a clue, a part of the story. But they didn't know her, and they certainly didn't know her mother. Emily could hear her grandmother's voice in her head, a warning she had always carried with her. "Some things are better left alone, Emily." She pushed it aside. Her grandmother's silence had never protected her mother. It had only hidden the truth. And now Emily was done living in the shadows. By the time the first response arrived, Emily had already convinced herself that this search, this chase for the truth, might be the only thing that finally brought her peace. But the file, when it came, was thinner than she had imagined. It was marked with red tape, its edges curling from age. She could almost feel the weight of the decades pressing down on it. Inside there were only fragments, old photos, names, and a strange note about a witness statement from a nurse at the hospital. But the most unsettling part was a single line written on the final page. Possible connection to Paul Reiner, co-worker of Carolyn Hayes. The name hit Emily like a jolt. She had never heard it before. Who was Paul Reiner? She whispered to the empty room. Emily sat at her kitchen table, staring at the name Paul Reiner. It felt foreign, distant, as if the ink on the paper was somehow wrong. She had spent weeks with the case file, hoping for some clarity, but the name, so casually written in those faded pages, raised more questions than answers. Who was Paul Reiner, and why had her mother's case file singled him out? The file held only the briefest mention. Possible connection to Paul Reiner, co-worker of Carolyn Hayes. Nothing more, no details, no explanation. But it was enough to make Emily feel a cold chill. The next day, Emily visited the old library on Broad Street, where she'd spent hours as a child seeking solace in books. She pulled out a dusty directory from 1982, hoping to find a trace of Paul Reiner. It felt like searching for a needle in a haystack, but the files had been her lifeline. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through pages of names, addresses, and occupations. It was all so ordinary until she found it. Paul Reiner. He had worked as a technician at the hospital during the same time Carolyn had been there. But unlike Carolyn, he had remained in Richmond, never leaving for new opportunities, never moving away. His name wasn't in the obituaries. His name didn't appear in any other police records. Nothing. Why had he stayed behind? Emily whispered. It didn't make sense. With a sinking feeling, Emily picked up the phone and dialed the Virginia State Police again. The voice on the other end was familiar. Caleb from the Cold Case Division. Miss Hayes? His voice was warm, comforting, but there was an underlying caution in his tone. We've done some digging into Paul Reiner. He's still alive, living outside Roanoke. But Emily, there's more we haven't shared with you yet. Emily's heart raced. What more? Caleb paused, then continued. There are whispers. Nothing solid yet, but some people claim they saw him the night Carolyn went missing. He was spotted near the hospital that evening, just before she disappeared. Emily's mind raced. She could see it now, the missing pieces falling into place. Her mother had been terrified of someone, and now Paul Reiner's name appeared in the same breath as hers. Could he have been involved? Emily's voice was barely a whisper. We're not sure, Caleb said. But we'll look into it. You may want to consider speaking to some of his old co-workers from back then. Sometimes the people closest to the case know more than they realize. Emily hung up the phone, her thoughts spinning. Roanoke was 2 hours away. If she was going to find answers, she had to act fast. As she packed a bag and prepared to leave, the weight of the moment hit her. This wasn't just about finding out what happened to her mother anymore. It was about confronting the past, about understanding the connections that had been hidden for decades. The road to Roanoke stretched out before her, endless and uncertain, but Emily had never been more determined. Every mile she drove was a step closer to the truth, to understanding the pieces of a story that had haunted her for far too long. And in her heart, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't walking into this mystery alone. Her mother's presence was with her, guiding her every step of the way. Roanoke felt different from Richmond. The air was thicker, and the hills stretched out like endless waves, cloaking the small town in an almost eerie stillness. Emily drove through the streets with a sense of urgency, but also a creeping anxiety. What would she find in this town? Would Paul Reiner recognize her, or would he even remember her mother? She parked outside a small diner near the edge of town and took a deep breath. Her hands were sweaty, the coolness of the air doing little to calm her nerves. She didn't know what she expected, but the thought of speaking to someone from that long-ago time made her heart race. Inside the diner, the bell above the door rang softly as she entered. The place was quiet. Only a few patrons sat at the counter, sipping coffee and murmuring to each other. A waitress with a name tag that read Janet walked over to Emily. She had sharp features, silver hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, and eyes that were both curious and wary. "Can I help you?" Janet asked, folding a napkin in her hands. Emily hesitated for a moment, then spoke. I'm looking for someone who used to work at Richmond Memorial in 1982. A man named Paul Reiner. Do you know him? Janet's eyes flickered with something, recognition maybe, or fear. She blinked quickly and took a step back, her hand tightening around the napkin. Emily could feel the tension in the air. I used to work at the hospital back then, Janet said, voice quieter now. But I don't really remember much about him. Emily noticed the shift in her tone, the discomfort, the careful choice of words. Something wasn't right. I just need to know if you remember anything about Paul or my mother, Emily pressed, trying to keep her voice steady. Anything at all? Janet looked around the diner, as if searching for an escape, before sitting down on the opposite side of the table. Her hands trembled as she folded the napkin into smaller and smaller pieces. Carolyn Hayes, she whispered. I remember her. I remember seeing her that night. Emily leaned in, her pulse quickening. What do you mean? What happened that night? Janet's eyes darted around the room again, as if making sure no one else was listening. She lowered her voice even further. She was scared. Paul was following her. She said she didn't want to go home with him. He kept asking her to get in his car, but she didn't want to. I thought he was just some overzealous guy, but now... Her voice trailed off. Emily's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. She was finally getting somewhere. Janet's words felt like pieces of a puzzle she had been chasing for years. Where did you see them? Was it at the hospital? Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper now. Janet nodded slowly, her gaze distant. Yeah. Right outside the emergency exit. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, after all these years, I wonder if it was more than just a misunderstanding. Emily's mind was spinning. She had to know more. She needed to find Paul Reiner. But as Janet shifted uncomfortably in her seat, Emily felt a new weight settle in her chest. Was this all just a twisted misunderstanding? Or was Paul Reiner something much darker than she had imagined? Do you know where Paul is now? Emily asked, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. Janet looked at her for a long moment before nodding. Yeah. He's in Roanoke. I don't know the exact address, but I know where he lives. It's a small house on the outskirts of town near the old factory. You can't miss it. Emily stood up, her legs shaking. Thank you, she whispered. As she left the diner, the weight of the moment hit her. She had a name. She had a place. But did she have enough to piece the truth together? The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the streets. Emily drove towards the outskirts of town where everything felt quieter, darker. The road ahead was unfamiliar, but she had come this far. She had to see this through. The house was smaller than Emily expected, an old single-story cottage with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the occasional car passing by on the dusty road. She parked her car a few houses down and sat for a moment, staring at the place. The weight of the evening pressed against her chest, her breath shallow. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the street cloaked in darkness, but the house was faintly lit by a single porch light. It felt strange, coming this far. She had thought about this moment for years, imagined what she would say, how she would confront the man who might have answers about her mother's disappearance. But now that she was here, standing at the threshold of his world, the words seemed to vanish. It wasn't just Paul Reiner she was confronting. It was the echoes of her own family, the unspoken things that had stayed hidden for too long. Emily had spent her entire life feeling the absence of her mother, but it wasn't just the memory of Carolyn Hayes that haunted her. It was the way her family had dealt with the silence, her grandmother's closed doors, her father's coldness. It was as if everyone had agreed not to ask too many questions. Her father, David Hayes, had always been a mystery to Emily. He was there, physically, but emotionally absent. He'd never once shared stories about her mother, and whenever Emily brought up Carolyn, his face would close off like a vault. She had learned to stop asking, and yet the questions lingered in every corner of her mind. As Emily walked up to Paul Reiner's front door, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text message from her father. "I don't want you involved in this, Emily. Some things are better left alone." Her heart sank as she stared at the screen. The same words her grandmother had said to her all those years ago. The same warning to leave the past buried, but she wasn't going to turn back now. With trembling hands, she knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the stillness of the night. Moments passed before she heard the shuffle of footsteps on the other side. The door creaked open, and there he was, Paul Reiner, older now, his face lined with time but his eyes still sharp. "Can I help you?" His voice was gravelly, cautious, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He had to know why she was here. "I'm Emily Hayes," she said, her voice steady but soft. "My mother, Carolyn Hayes, she disappeared in 1982, right after she left Richmond Memorial." Paul's face shifted, something dark flickering behind his eyes. He opened his mouth but then paused, as if carefully choosing his words. "I've heard about that case," he said slowly. "It's been a long time." Emily's heart raced. She wasn't sure if she was ready to hear what he might say next. She took a deep breath. "My mother was scared of you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "She said your name. She said you followed her the night she disappeared. Is that true?" For a long moment, Paul didn't answer. His gaze fell to the ground, and the air between them grew thick with unspoken words. Finally he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I never meant to hurt her," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "But I was obsessed. She didn't want to see me. She didn't want anything to do with me. But I couldn't let go. I thought if I could just get her to talk, maybe she would understand." Emily's chest tightened. His words didn't make sense. Nothing he said could justify her mother's fear, her disappearance. "I don't know what happened to her that night," Paul continued, his eyes avoiding hers. "I wish I could tell you, but after that, I didn't see her again. I swear." Emily's mind spun. He was admitting something, but not enough. The pieces didn't fit together. The fear she felt was still there, a constant gnawing feeling that told her this wasn't over. She took a step back. "You're telling me you didn't have anything to do with it?" Paul's silence was answer enough. Emily didn't wait for him to speak again. She turned and walked back down the path, her mind racing with confusion and anger. There was something he wasn't saying, something bigger than just obsession. As she reached her car, the cold night air pressed against her skin, but inside her heart was burning with a sense of unresolved tension. She didn't know how much closer she was to the truth, but one thing was clear. Paul Reiner knew more than he was letting on. Emily sat in her car staring at the house she had just left. The words Paul had spoken echoed in her mind. "I wish I could tell you." His admission of obsession, of following her mother, didn't sit right with her, but there was something in his eyes. Something more than just guilt or regret. There was fear. The truth felt closer now, but still just out of reach. She drove back to Richmond, her mind churning with questions, but it wasn't until she reached her grandmother's house that she felt the familiar knot of unease tightening in her chest. Her grandmother's house, a place of childhood memories, still held its old comforting charm. The scent of lavender, the creaking wooden floors, and the old furniture that had been passed down through generations. Emily had never fully understood the weight of the place until now. She stepped inside and, without a word, went upstairs to the attic. It was a room she hadn't visited in years. Dust hung in the air, and the low light from the small window only added to the room's somber atmosphere. Boxes were stacked high, filled with forgotten items from the past. She had often wondered what secrets were tucked away in these boxes, but never had the courage to open them. Today was different. Her grandmother had passed away 5 years ago, but the silence of the house seemed to speak to her. Emily was certain there was something here, something that had been hidden away for decades. She opened the first box, pulling out old photographs, letters, and yellowed newspaper clippings. Nothing seemed to catch her eye until she reached the bottom, where a small wooden box lay buried beneath layers of forgotten memories. It was intricately carved, its surface worn by time. She hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside there were a few items: a tarnished key, an old pocket watch, and a small envelope with the words, "For Carolyn," written in delicate handwriting. Emily's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside, she found a letter, the paper thin and fragile. The ink had faded over the years, but Emily could make out the words, "I'm sorry for what I've done. Please understand. I couldn't let you go. You were my everything. I never meant to hurt you. I only wanted you to stay, Paul." The letter dropped from her hands as she sat back on the floor, her mind reeling. The words were haunting, chilling in their simplicity. The man who had followed her mother, the man who had claimed to have been obsessed, had written this letter. He had confessed in writing to something much darker than Emily had realized. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the significance of what she had found. This wasn't just a letter. It was a cry for help, an admission of guilt, and a desperate plea. She grabbed the letter, clutching it in her hands as she stood up. The answers were beginning to fall into place, but with each answer the questions grew darker. Was Paul Reiner involved in her mother's disappearance? The evidence was becoming clearer, but the truth was still elusive. Emily didn't know what to do with the letter. Should she take it to the police? Should she confront Paul again with this new revelation? Or was this just another piece of a puzzle that would never truly fit? As she stood there holding the letter in her hands, she felt the weight of her mother's absence more than ever before. Carolyn's voice seemed to echo in the silence of the room, urging her to keep going, to keep searching for the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the letter she had found wasn't the full story. It felt like a confession, but it was incomplete, more a fragment of truth than the whole picture. She knew she couldn't rely on just Paul's word, or even the haunting message he'd written. There was something she hadn't yet discovered, something buried in the past, waiting to surface. As she sat back in her grandmother's attic, the faint smell of old wood and dust thick in the air, Emily opened the small photo album that had been tucked into the box with the letter. Her hands shook slightly as she flipped through the faded pages, most of the photos yellowed with time, family pictures, people she didn't know. But as she turned the page, she stopped cold. There on the next page was a photograph of a smiling young woman holding a baby. The woman was Carolyn, no question about it, but standing next to her was someone Emily had never seen before, a man, tall with dark hair and sharp features, standing with his arm casually draped over Carolyn's shoulder. His smile seemed almost too forced, his eyes staring directly into the camera with an unsettling intensity. He looked familiar, though she couldn't place where she had seen him before. Emily studied the photo more closely, her heart pounding in her chest. Who was he? She quickly scanned the back of the photograph for a date or any other clues. There was none. But something else caught her eye, a name scrawled in small handwriting in the bottom corner. The name was Paul Reiner. Her mind raced. This was the same man. The same Paul Reiner who had been obsessed with her mother? She turned the photo over in her hands again and again, as if she could will the answers to appear. The face in the photograph seemed so familiar now, as if he had always been a part of her mother's life. Had he been there all along, quietly lurking in the background? Emily's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. Her heart skipped a beat, the noise echoing in the otherwise quiet house. She stood up quickly, the photo still clutched in her hand. It was the knock she had been dreading. Taking a deep breath, Emily made her way downstairs, her mind spinning with the questions she wasn't ready to ask. She opened the door, half expecting to find Paul standing there again. But it wasn't Paul. Standing on the other side was Detective Marcus Reed, the officer who had been investigating the cold case for years. His face was stern, his eyes clouded with the weight of unspoken truths. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice low, "I need to talk to you." Emily stepped back, motioning for him to come in. "What's going on? Is it about Paul?" Marcus paused for a moment, then nodded gravely. "Yes, we've got some new information. You're going to want to hear this." Her heart raced as she followed him into the living room, the photo of Paul Reiner still clenched tightly in her hand. The detective's words hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. "Let's sit down," Marcus said. "There's something I need to tell you about Paul Reiner." Emily's mind raced as she sat across from him, the photograph still resting on her lap. She didn't know it yet, but the truth was about to come crashing down. Emily sat down across from Detective Marcus Reed, the photograph of Paul Reiner still clenched tightly in her hands. The atmosphere in the room felt heavy, suffocating. There was a tense silence before Marcus spoke, his voice low but steady. "You've found out more than I expected," he said, eyeing the photograph in her hand. "That man, Paul Reiner. We've been looking into him for months, but there's something you need to know, something you probably don't want to hear." Emily's stomach dropped. The words didn't feel like a warning, they felt like a verdict. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Paul's involvement in your mother's case goes deeper than we first thought. He wasn't just obsessed, he was hiding something. Something he's kept buried for years." Emily's heart raced. "What do you mean? What has he been hiding?" The detective leaned forward, his face grim. "We found new evidence. Found new. A series of letters, photographs, and even some personal items that connect Paul to your mother in ways we didn't expect. But the most disturbing thing? There's a report from a nurse at the hospital. She claims she saw Paul leaving the emergency room on the night your mother disappeared. She said he was in a hurry, like he was trying to cover his tracks." Emily's hands trembled as she held the photograph, her mind spinning. "But Paul told me. He said he didn't see her after that night, that he didn't know what happened to her." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know. But the evidence tells a different story. We have a witness who saw him, and we've found items that shouldn't have been left behind. It's clear now, Emily, Paul was involved in her disappearance, and not just in a casual way. He was at the hospital, and he was there when she left." Emily felt as though the ground beneath her was crumbling. She had suspected Paul's involvement, but hearing the confirmation, the weight of it, hit her harder than she had imagined. She couldn't wrap her mind around it. Her mother's fate, the one she had spent her whole life trying to understand, was now tied to this man who had once been a part of her life in some way she didn't fully understand. What does that mean? "Is he—" Emily's voice caught in her throat. "Is he the one who took her?" Marcus sighed, his face tight with the struggle to find the right words. "We can't say for certain yet. We still don't know what happened after she left the hospital. But we do know one thing for sure. Paul Reiner had more than just a passing interest in your mother. He had a hold on her, and when she tried to break free, things went wrong." The words hit Emily like a punch to the stomach. She had always feared that her mother's disappearance was tied to someone she knew, someone who had crossed a line. But to hear it confirmed, to know that it was Paul, this man who had once been so close to her mother, it was almost too much to bear. "I need to talk to him again," Emily said, her voice shaky but determined. "I need to hear it from him. I need to know why he did it." Marcus's expression softened, but there was no sympathy in his eyes. "Be careful, Emily. Paul's not the man you think he is. He's dangerous, and he's been hiding the truth for a long time." Emily stood up, her mind already set. "I have to do this. I have to face him." As she walked out of the room, the weight of the truth pressing on her chest, she felt a flicker of hope. The answers were within reach, but they were more painful than she had ever imagined. The photograph of Paul Reiner, now burned into her memory, haunted her thoughts. He was the key. She just had to get to him before it was too late. Emily stood outside Paul Reiner's house, her heart racing as she stared at the front door. She had made the decision. She was going to confront him again, demand answers. But as she gripped the handle of the door, she hesitated. She had no idea what she would hear from him this time. Would he admit everything? Would he try to deny it all over again? The cold air wrapped around her like a blanket, and for a moment she closed her eyes, taking a steadying breath. She wasn't just looking for answers anymore. She was looking for closure, for the peace that had eluded her for decades. The door opened, and there he was. Paul, standing there with a look of surprise but not shock. It was almost as if he had expected her. "Emily," he said, his voice soft, guarded. He was older now, the years weighing heavily on him, but there was still something about him that made her stomach twist. "I didn't think you'd come back." "I have more questions," Emily said, her voice stronger than she felt. "And I need answers." Paul stepped back, silently inviting her in. As she walked inside, the familiar smell of stale coffee and old furniture hit her. It was the same feeling she had gotten the first time she stepped into his house. But now, the air felt thicker, charged with something unspoken, something heavier. They both sat in the living room, the silence stretching between them before Emily spoke again. "I found something. Something I don't understand." "A letter. A confession." Her voice faltered as she said the word, but she kept her eyes fixed on him. "What was it that you did to my mother, Paul?" Paul shifted in his seat, avoiding her gaze. For a long moment he didn't answer, but the guilt was visible in his posture, in the way his hands trembled slightly. Emily's pulse quickened as she waited for him to speak. "I never meant to hurt her," Paul finally said, his voice low. He ran a hand through his graying hair, looking at the floor as though searching for the right words. "But I couldn't let her go. I was in love with her. Obsessed with her, even." His voice wavered with emotion, but there was something about his confession that made Emily's stomach churn. "Go obsessed," she repeated, her voice sharper now. "You followed her, you terrified her, you made her feel like there was no escape. And you think that was just obsession?" Paul's eyes finally met hers, and there was something cold in his gaze, something that hadn't been there before. "You don't understand," he said, almost pleading. "I thought if I could just make her see me, just make her understand how much I cared, she would stay. I thought if I could keep her with me, everything would be okay." Emily's hands tightened into fists as the pieces fell into place. He didn't just want her. He needed her to stay. The realization hit her hard. His obsession had clouded his judgment, twisted his love into something dangerous. She pulled the photo out of her bag, the one from her grandmother's attic, the one that had shaken her to the core. "Why was this photo taken, Paul? Why were you in my mother's life like that? Why weren't you ever told to stay away?" His face went pale at the sight of the photograph. He didn't answer at first, but his silence was enough. The guilt, the fear, it was all there. "I didn't want anyone to know," he whispered. "I didn't want anyone to take her away from me." Emily felt a cold rush of dread. "Did you take her, Paul? Did you kill her?" For a moment, the room seemed to grow darker, heavier. Paul looked away, his hands trembling now. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he muttered. "But when she left that night, she was going to talk to someone. She was going to tell everything. I couldn't let her do that." Emily's blood ran cold. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "I didn't mean to," Paul whispered again. "It was an accident. She tried to run, and I lost control." The words hung in the air, more chilling than anything she could have imagined. Emily's mind reeled, but she could barely process what she had just heard. She had come here for answers, but what she had gotten was something far darker. "Paul," Emily said quietly, standing up, "you have to face the consequences for what you did. This can't go on." As she turned to leave, Paul's voice stopped her. "Please, don't tell anyone. You won't understand." His voice cracked. But Emily didn't stop. She walked out of his house feeling like the weight of her mother's disappearance was finally beginning to lift. But the road ahead wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Emily's hand trembled as she reached for her phone. The conversation with Paul had shaken her to her core, but there was something still gnawing at her, a question that wouldn't leave. Did he really kill her mother, or was it just an accident? The memory of his words haunted her. "It was an accident. She tried to run, and I lost control." Emily could barely make sense of it. But there was something else, something deeper, something in his eyes that screamed of hidden truths. She couldn't keep running from it. There had to be more evidence, something that could make it clearer. That's when she remembered the cassette tape, an old recording from the hospital security office, one she had heard rumors about years ago. "Wait," she whispered to herself, sitting in her car. "The confession. The tape." A chill ran down her spine. She had heard the story of a security guard who had been quietly let go from the hospital after Carolyn's disappearance. A few months ago, Emily had learned that the guard had kept a set of recordings, something that could have been lost to time. Emily had pushed it aside, unsure if it would hold any real value. But now, with the pieces finally falling into place, she knew she had to track it down. She made the call. "Virginia State Police, Detective Reed speaking," came the voice on the other end. "Detective, I need your help. I think I found something important. A tape, one from the hospital security office in 1982. It could be about my mother." The line was silent for a moment before Reed's voice came back, now a little sharper. "I know the one you're talking about, Miss Hayes. It's been in our possession for a while, but there's more to it." Emily's pulse quickened. "More? What do you mean?" Reed paused, then sighed. "The tape has a confession from Paul Reiner. I didn't want to tell you until we had more concrete evidence, but it's clear now that Paul was involved. The tape, it confirms everything you feared." Her throat tightened. "What's on it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reed's voice softened. He admits to following her. He admits to being at the hospital that night. And most importantly, he confesses to losing control. He sounds terrified, Miss Hayes, like he knows exactly what he did, and he's afraid of facing the consequences. Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "But is it enough to charge him? We've got enough to make an arrest. We'll be moving forward with it." The words hit her like a wave. All these years, all the questions, and now finally there was justice on the horizon. But still, the reality of it all felt too much to bear. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to hear Paul's voice on that tape, confessing what she had always feared. "Thank you," Emily whispered. "Please keep me updated." As she hung up, her hands shook with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The years of searching for answers, the years of feeling lost in a cloud of uncertainty, it was finally coming to an end. But the truth came at a heavy price. She sat in her car, staring at the phone in her hands. In the quiet of the vehicle, everything felt surreal. The truth was no longer hidden in shadows, but it didn't bring the peace she had expected. She had always imagined that when the truth came, it would set her free. But now all it did was open up an abyss. The road ahead still felt unclear, but one thing was certain: she had come too far to stop now. The news hit Emily like a shockwave. She had spent years searching for the truth, but now that it was here, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. Paul Reiner, the man who had haunted her thoughts for so long, was about to be arrested. It wasn't a relief. It was a storm of emotions. Relief, yes, but also anger, fear, and grief. Justice was finally coming, but the cost was something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The arrest was scheduled for the following morning. Detective Marcus Reed had briefed her on the details, but the finality of it all still felt unreal. She was about to face the man who had taken so much from her, who had broken her family in ways she could never have imagined. The streets of Roanoke were quiet as Emily drove toward Paul's house. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the familiar tension building in her chest. As she approached his street, she noticed the heavy police presence. Officers in plain clothes, squad cars parked along the curb. It was happening. The man who had hidden his secrets for so long was about to be exposed. She parked a block away, unable to bring herself to drive any closer. The finality of it was overwhelming. Part of her wanted to be there, to watch him get arrested, but another part of her feared what she might see. Would he try to run? Would he deny everything once again, now that the truth was out? The police had him surrounded, and Emily's heart pounded as she watched from a distance. She had come so far, but in this moment it all felt distant, like a story that wasn't truly hers. Detective Reed approached her from behind, his expression somber. "He's being taken in for questioning," he said quietly. "We have enough to charge him with your mother's disappearance, but there's still a lot of work ahead. He's not going down without a fight." Emily nodded, the knot in her throat tightening. Is this really it? Is he going to face the consequences? Reed gave her a grim look. He'll be processed. We'll gather more evidence, make sure we have everything we need to bring him to trial. But Emily, we're getting closer. After all these years, he won't get away with it. Her hands trembled in her lap as she tried to take it all in. After all these years, the words seemed to reverberate in her mind. They had become a refrain in her life, a constant hum of doubt and grief. But now, after years of chasing shadows, it was finally coming to an end. Emily watched as Paul was escorted from his house in handcuffs, his head lowered, his expression unreadable. There were no apologies, no signs of remorse. He looked like a man caught, not a man who had spent decades hiding the truth. It was over. But was it? Emily stared at him, her heart heavy with questions. Did he really regret what he had done? Or was he simply afraid of the consequences? Would she ever truly understand why he did it? Or would she have to live with the fact that some answers were never meant to be found? As the police drove him away, Emily remained still. The arrest was the beginning of the end, but it was also the start of a new chapter, one where she would have to face the reality of what had happened to her mother, and that reality, she knew, was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The courtroom was cold, its sterile air pressing down on Emily's shoulders as she took her seat. The wooden benches creaked as people shuffled in, the sound mingling with the faint rustling of papers. This was it, the place where the truth would finally be laid bare. Her heart pounded in her chest, every beat a reminder of the years of unanswered questions. But now the pieces were coming together. Today was the day Paul Reiner would stand before the court. He would answer for the lies he had told and the pain he had caused. Emily looked around the room. The prosecutor, David Henson, sat at the front, his expression focused and calm. The defense lawyer was already speaking to Paul, a man in his late 50s who appeared as unshaken as Paul himself. Neither seemed remotely worried about the storm they had created. Emily's gaze shifted to Paul. He sat there, hands folded in front of him, his face pale but composed. He no longer looked like the man she had met during her visit to his house, the man who had confessed to his obsession, his fear, his regret. Now, he was simply a defendant, someone accused of an unspeakable crime. The trial began and the tension in the room thickened. The prosecution's opening statement was brief, but to the point. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today because a woman, Carolyn Hayes, disappeared from Richmond Memorial Hospital in 1982. She was last seen leaving the hospital with a man she feared, a man who should have been a part of her life but instead turned into her worst nightmare. We will show you, through testimony and evidence, that this man, Paul Reiner, was the one who took her. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. Those words, "took her," were so final. They made the whole thing feel real, the magnitude of it crashing over her like a wave. She had known, of course, she had suspected it, but hearing it spoken aloud with certainty was different. She had always felt like a piece of the puzzle was missing, and now hearing the prosecutor's voice, it was like that missing piece had finally clicked into place. Paul's lawyer rose to defend him. His tone was calm, measured. "This is not a case of murder, ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning to the jury. "This is a case of a man whose actions were misunderstood, whose intentions were misinterpreted. We will show you that there was no malicious intent in Mr. Reiner's actions. The evidence will support this." Emily clenched her fists. She had heard all the arguments before, but this time it felt different. The defense was trying to paint Paul as a man who had made a mistake, not a man who had intentionally taken her mother's life. The witnesses began to testify. First, the nurse who had seen Paul at the hospital that night, and then the security guard who had recorded the conversation. Every word felt like a punch to Emily's gut, but she couldn't look away. She couldn't afford to. This was the moment of truth. She had spent years searching for it. She had to see it through. When it was time for Emily to speak, she stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. Her voice was shaky as she began, but it grew stronger with each word. "I am Carolyn Hayes' daughter, and I have spent my whole life wondering what happened to her. I spent years imagining that someday someone would tell me the truth, that I would finally know why my mother is gone. And today, after all this time, I finally have my answer." The room was quiet, all eyes on her. It's not just about justice. It's about the truth that has been hidden for so long, and it's time for it to come out. Paul didn't look at her. His face remained impassive, but Emily could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands. This was it, the final step. The truth was finally out, and there was no going back. The trial had taken its toll on Emily. Every day in the courtroom had been a battle. Each word, each revelation, another piece of her mother's shattered past exposed. But today, as the court session ended and she left the building, something felt different. The weight of the truth hung heavy in the air, but it wasn't just the case she had been fighting for that lingered. It was something else, something she had nearly forgotten. That night, as she returned to her grandmother's house, Emily found herself drawn back to the attic. The familiar scent of dust and aged wood greeted her, the silence surrounding her almost comforting now. She had spent so many hours here in the past few weeks, digging through the remnants of a life she hadn't known, searching for pieces of a story that had eluded her for decades. But this time it wasn't the old boxes or the files that caught her attention. Instead, it was a small weathered envelope that had slipped out from the bottom of one of the boxes. It was addressed to Carolyn Hayes, her mother's name written in delicate handwriting. The envelope looked almost out of place, untouched by time compared to the rest of the forgotten memories surrounding it. With trembling hands, Emily carefully opened it, her heart racing as she unfolded the letter inside. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible, and each one felt like a stab to her heart. "Carolyn," it began, "I know you don't understand why I did what I did. I'm not sure I understand it myself, but I can't bear the thought of losing you. I've made mistakes, so many mistakes, but I thought if you knew the truth, maybe you'd forgive me. I'm sorry for everything, for what I did to us, to you. I was selfish, and I couldn't let you go. Please understand." Emily's breath caught in her throat as she read the words over and over. They were familiar, so familiar, and yet they made no sense. "I couldn't let you go." The words echoed in her mind, resonating like a warning. There was something in them, something that chilled her to the core. The letter continued, but the rest of it blurred as Emily's mind raced. She had known that Paul's obsession had been unhealthy, but this wasn't just obsession. This was a desperate attempt to control, to keep Carolyn in his grasp no matter the cost. She swallowed hard, the heaviness of the letter sinking deep within her. It wasn't just a confession. It was a plea for forgiveness, yes, but also a reflection of a love twisted into something unrecognizable. Emily had always known that her mother's disappearance was linked to Paul, but she hadn't realized the depth of the emotional hold he had on her. It wasn't just fear that had driven Carolyn to leave. It was a fight for her life, her independence. The letter felt like the final piece of the puzzle, a piece that made everything make sense, but at the same time left Emily feeling more hollow than ever. As the evening darkened around her, Emily sat there in the attic, the letter clutched tightly in her hands. It wasn't just her mother's past that she had unearthed, it was her own too. The truth had come at a cost, and while Paul was facing his consequences, Emily knew that she still had a long way to go before she could find peace. Her gaze fell to the window, the moonlight casting long shadows across the room. She wasn't sure what came next, but the letter had given her one last piece of her mother's voice, one last message from a woman she had never known. And in that moment, Emily understood. It wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about healing, about finding a way to move forward. The truth had come, but it was up to her to decide how to carry it. The courtroom was silent as the judge read out the final verdict. Emily sat still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on Paul Reiner. The years of searching, the years of pain, had all led up to this moment. She had seen him confess, had heard the truth of her mother's life, and death revealed. Now it was time for the justice she had fought so hard for. "Guilty," the judge said, his voice firm and unyielding. "The defendant, Paul Reiner, is hereby sentenced for the abduction and murder of Carolyn Hayes. Sentencing will occur next week." The words were final, and yet they did not bring the relief Emily had imagined. Paul, handcuffed and silent, had no words, no defense left. His expression remained the same, cold, almost resigned. But the weight of the moment settled over Emily like a heavy blanket. Justice had been served, yes, but there was a finality to it that still didn't sit well with her. Her mind drifted back to the moments she had spent in the courtroom, to the pain of hearing about the man who had ruined her mother's life. She'd stood in that witness stand, telling her story to the jury, recounting what little she knew about the woman who had given her life, but whom she had never really known. And through it all she had clung to one thought: once this is over, I'll have the answers. The truth will finally set me free. But now the truth wasn't just a release, it was a weight, a burden. As the courtroom emptied and people filed out, Emily remained seated. She had expected to feel something else, closure perhaps, but what she felt now was emptiness. The journey had been long, filled with twists and turns, dead ends and moments of hope. But in the end she still wasn't sure if she had gotten what she needed. There were too many things left unsaid, too many layers of grief she had not yet peeled away. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice. "Emily?" She looked up to see Detective Marcus Reed standing beside her, his expression kind but weary. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Emily shook her head, not quite sure how to answer. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "It's over, but it doesn't feel like I thought it would." Marcus sat down beside her, his voice lowering. "You don't get to heal in a moment, Emily. You've spent a lifetime in pain and it's going to take time. But the truth, it's not just about justice, it's about you finding peace with it, and that's going to take as long as it takes." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I never really knew her, you know. I only ever had pieces. And now that I know, it's like I've lost her all over again." Marcus nodded slowly. "I understand. But remember, you weren't the only one who was searching for her. You found the truth, and that matters more than you think." Emily stood up, feeling a little lighter. "Thank you, Marcus. For everything." He smiled softly. "You're welcome. You don't have to do this alone anymore." As Emily left the courthouse, she stepped out into the late afternoon sun. The world felt quieter now, more still. The chaos of the trial, the anger, the fear, it was all behind her. But something inside her had shifted. She could feel the weight of the past begin to lift, little by little, like the clearing of a storm cloud. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she felt ready to face it. For the first time in a long while, Emily allowed herself to breathe deeply. The journey wasn't over, but it had reached its end, for now. The truth had come to light, and now it was up to her to find her way forward, one step at a time.